Hello, my dudes, and welcome to another episode of reviewing my psychology notes. My AP psychology test is in about 3-4 days, and I need to study. So here we go with that. So today we're going to be looking at Unit 9, Social Psychology. I don't actually remember where we were in the last video that I made, so if I'm recording the same chapter again, my bad, but you got some more cool images to look at, because I'm drawing mushrooms and other cute things, so yeah. So let's begin with social psychology. Social psychologists are the psychologists that study the scientific study of how we think about, influence, and relate to one another. The attribution theory is a theory that we explain someone's behavior by crediting either the situation or the person's disposition. Fundamental attribution error is the tendency for observers when analyzing others' behavior to underestimate the impact of the situation and to overestimate the impact of personal disposition. For example, people think you're friendly when they know you're acting or they don't know you're acting. Like, whether they know you're acting or not, they still think that you're friendly. Some countries that have, some cultures, for instance, the Japanese culture, don't make the fundamental attribution error as much because they're aware of a lot more etiquette and stuff that's going on. I think there wasn't a lot of details about that in my notes. Self-serving bias is a readiness to perceive yourself or oneself favorably. Attitudes are feelings often influenced by our beliefs that predispose us to respond in a particular way to objects, people, and events. So, an example of how attitude can affect your actions is that when you're having a negative attitude about something, it makes doing that thing a lot less enjoyable, even if it was something that could be fun. If you're having a negative attitude about it, you don't have fun doing it as much as you could. Peripheral root persuasion occurs when people are influenced incidentally or influenced by incidental cues, such as a speaker's attractiveness. For instance, perfume ads have attractive actors, and so then people are more likely to buy that perfume because of how cute the actors are. Central root persuasion occurs when interested people focus on the argument and respond with favorable thoughts. For instance, facts about global warming can make it more believable. Foot in the door phenomenon is the tendency for people who have first agreed to a small request to comply later with a larger request. For example, if you ask to borrow a pen before asking someone else to do a favor for you, like a larger favor. A role is a set of expectations or norms about a social position, defining how those in the position ought to behave. Then it says to summarize Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. There's a movie on Netflix that I thought illustrated it really, really well, and it's just called The Stanford Prison Experiment. If your Netflix is set to PG-13, you're going to have to turn that setting off because there's a lot of swearing and mild violence and major inappropriate behavior. But what happened with Zimbardo's prison experiment was that Zimbardo was a scientist and he was simulating the experience of being in a prison. So over summer break, he turned the basement of a college into a prison to make it look really realistic of a prison. And then he got mentally and physically healthy volunteers. I don't remember the exact number, but he flipped a coin to determine which would be people who were in the jail and which would be people who were the enforcers in the jail. I forget the titles. Officer and prisoner, I think. And then they wanted to see how these people would react when put in these roles. and see if the role they were in had anything to do with the way they were acting, and if they were just acting a certain way because of the role they were in, or if that was their personality. And so they had real cops go and arrest the the people who were going to be the prisoners, take them to the basement and put them in the prison. They had to wear hospital night dresses, and all of the people in this experiment were male. And then the other half of the experimenters, the prison enforcers, came in and were there to watch them. And they were meant to do it for 2 weeks, which was 14 days. But things got so violent and out of hand that they actually had to stop after 6 days because people were taking on the rules and it was going really not well. The people in the position of prisoners were becoming hopeless and resigned to their fate and depressed and going a little bit crazy, kind of. And the people in the role of the enforcers were just doing whatever they wanted to the prisoners besides physically hurting them because they weren't allowed to do that. But they were forcing them to do degrading acts, making them strip naked for the different inspections, making them eat off the floor, making them do the same kind of thing over and over again, and a lot of them had actual mental issues afterwards. And some studies say that they were able to fully recover after being out of that situation, but it took a while, and it just proves that a lot of times something that you're doing might have to do with the role that you're in, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with your personality outside of it. Alright, now we have Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory, the theory that we act to reduce the discomfort, dissonance we feel when two of our thoughts, cognitions, are inconsistent. For example, when we become aware that our attitudes and our actions clash, we can reduce the resulting dissonance by changing our attitudes or by changing our actions. Conformity and obedience. So what's the chameleon effect? Automatic mimicry or mood congruency. Conformity is adjusting our behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standard. Asch's conformity experiment. His name is ASCH because I can't remember how to actually say it. Asch's conformity experiments. And it showed that people would give the wrong answer if a bunch of other people gave it before they did. So that experiment worked they had one person come into a room with a bunch of other people. That one person thought all the other people were also part of the experiment, but all the other people were actually actors. Then the person who was being the test giver, I forget the name of that person, would show them a bunch of cards. They would have a standard line, and then they would have to say which line on the card. They would give then some other lines. They would have a standard line, and then there would A, B, and C lines. And they would have to say which line was either the same or different than the standard line. And the people who were the actors would intentionally give the wrong answer to see if the person who was being part of the experiment would give the wrong answer so that he would agree with the rest of the group, or if he would give the right answer and stand off on his own. And they found that a lot of times the people would give the wrong answer, and it just depended on a lot of the factors, if there was anyone else there to support them in their saying the right answer even though everyone was saying the wrong answer. It depended on if the people who were also the actors were portrayed as people who would be in a higher status position or that would be smarter than them already. And so 4 reasons that make people more likely to conform are if they are made to feel incompetent or insecure, they're in a group with at least 3 people, They admire the group's status and attractiveness, and they have not made a prior commitment to any response. The normative social influence is influence resulting from a person's desire to gain approval or avoid disapproval. Informative social influence is influence resulting from one's willingness to accept others' opinions above reality, or about reality. Milgram's obedience experiment was an experiment where people were told to shock somebody in the other room if they got the wrong answer to a certain question. And there was a man in the room with them wearing a white lab coat who was told to tell them to keep going if they stopped. And the person in the other room wasn't actually getting shocked, but they were screaming every time they got shocked. Every time the person was told to shock them. So it was a test to see if people would do things that could be perceived as bad if a person in power or authority was telling them to do it, because they were trying to see if people's claims from being in World War II and just doing what they were told were correct or not. Then the foot in the door effect explains that they were able to give a mild shock first, and then it wasn't such a big deal to give a higher level shock. Then we'll learn about group behavior. Social facilitation is improved performance on simple or well-learned tasks in the presence of others. Why do we perform better when other people are there? Because the energizing effect of an enthusiastic audience spurs us on. Social loafing is the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pooling their efforts toward attaining a common goal than when individually accountable. What 3 things cause social loafing? People acting as part of a group feel less accountable and therefore worry less about what other people think. Group members may view their individual contributions as dispensable, and when group members share the benefit, no matter how much they contribute, some may slack off. Deindividuation is the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint occurring in group situations that foster arousal and anonymity, for instance, riots and mobs. Group polarization is the enhancement of a group's prevailing inclinations through discussion within a group. Groupthink is the mode of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in a decision-making group overrides a realistic appraisal of alternatives. What is the difference between social control and personal control? Social control is the power of the situation, and personal control is the power of the individual. What is minority influence? The power of 1 or 2 individuals to sway minorities. Culture is the enduring behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values, and traditions shared by a group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next. Norms are an understood rule, an accepted and expected behavior. Norms describe or prescribe proper behavior. For example, the norms of American society several years ago were that girls would play with dolls and boys would play with cars. I feel like that's not necessarily true anymore, but it still is for a lot of Americans. Prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an unjustifiable and usually negative attitude toward a group and its members. Prejudice generally involves stereotype beliefs, negative feelings, and a predisposition to discriminatory action. Prejudice is a 3-part mixture of beliefs, emotions, and predisposition to action. Stereotypes are a generalized, sometimes accurate, but often overgeneralized belief about a group of people. Ethnocentrism is assuming the superiority of one's ethnic group. Discrimination is unjustifiable negative behavior towards a group and its members. An example of how subtle prejudice lingers, even though overt prejudice might be gone. People of color are hired less and murdered more, even though racism is supposed to be gone from the United States. It's not. The just world phenomenon. The tendency for people to believe the world is just and that people therefore get what they deserve and deserve what they get. The in-group is us, or people with whom we share a common identity, and the out-group is them, those perceived as different or apart from our in-group. In-group bias is the tendency to favor our own group. Scapegoat theory is the theory that prejudice offers an outlet for anger for providing someone to blame. For example, after 9/11, innocent Arab Americans were harassed because the person who was theorized to have perpetrated it at the time before they knew was an Arab descendant. Other race effect. The tendency to recall faces of one's own race more accurately than faces of other races. Aggression. Aggression is any physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy. What are the 3 levels of biology involved in aggression? Genetic, neural, and biochemical. What parts of the brain are involved in human aggression? The amygdala and the frontal lobes. What chemical influences aggression? Testosterone, but also probably some others. That's just the one that I wrote. Trying to turn page. Frustration aggression principle is the principle that frustration or the blocking of attempt to achieve some goal creates anger, which can generate aggression. For example, if a child can't watch TV, they might be frustrated, which would then lead to aggression in which they would lash out physically against another family member. Social scripts are culturally culturally modeled guide for how to act in various situations. For example, learning to flirt from watching TV. Attraction. The mere exposure effect, the phenomenon that repeated exposure to novel stimuli increases liking of them. Some aspects to attractiveness are physical, proximity, and similarity. The reward theory of attraction says we like it and we want it, so we get it. Like that song by Ariana Grande. Passionate love. An aroused state of intense positive absorption in another, usually present at the beginning of a love relationship. Companionate love. The deep affectionate attachment we feel for those with whom our lives intertwined. Equity, a condition in which people receive from a relationship in proportion to what they give to it. Self-disclosure, revealing intimate aspects of yourself to others. Altruism, conflict, and peacemaking. Altruism is unselfish regard for the welfare of others. The example we were given was the story of Kitty Genovese, who was raped and stabbed, and I think it was in her apartment, but it might have been on the street outside her apartment building, and she screamed for hours, and there were people around who heard her, but nobody came to do anything about it. The bystander effect is the tendency for any given bystander to be less likely to give aid if other bystanders are present. The social exchange theory is the theory that our social behavior is an exchange process, the aim of which is to maximize benefits and minimize costs. The reciprocity norm is an expectation that people will help, not hurt, those who have helped them. The social responsibility norm is an expectation that people will help those needing their help. Conflict is a perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. Social traps, a situation in which the conflicting parties, by each rationally pursuing themselves interest or their self-interest rather than the good of the group, become caught in mutually destructive behavior, which is also called game theory or prisoner's dilemma. Mirror image perceptions. Mutual views often held by conflicting people, as when each side sees itself as ethical and peaceful, and views the other side as evil and aggressive. Self-fulfilling prophecy, a belief that leads to its own fulfillment. For instance, telling yourself that you're going to fail a test and then failing a test. It kind of has to do with if you have positive self-talk, you are more likely to succeed than if you have negative self-talk. It helps to put conflicting parties into close contact so that they can peacefully work out their differences. Ways to promote cooperation, superordinate goals, shared goals that override differences among people and require their cooperation. The GRIT strategy, or graduated and reciprocated initiatives intention reductions. A strategy designed to decrease international tension. Okay, so that was all of Unit 9. I hope that was helpful to you guys, and remember to study. I also recommend, if you're also studying for the AP test like me, to watch all of the Crash Course Psychologies, because I watched about an hour and a half of them yesterday, and my brain is like, oh yeah, I know that, so I'm going to watch some more of them a couple days before the test, and hopefully I'll pass, because that's important. Hope you guys are all doing well, and I will see you guys in the next video.